One of the things that's very weird about students these days is you less formal with us and more formal with us than you need to be. So I often get emails from you guys that are like, "Hi, Prof," or "Nicholas." I don't mind being called Nicholas. In fact, if you meet me and you say, "Hi, Professor Christakis," I'll say, "Call me Nicholas." But it's not a good idea to write to someone like you that you've never actually met. Not say, dear Nicholas, dear Professor Christakis. And then, and sometimes you'll write emails, because I was a housemaster before. You'll write emails to professors and I'm very busy this week and I can meet with you on Tuesday afternoon. I can assure you the professor is busier than you are. So it's, you should say, "I'm happy to meet with you." And then if you can meet none of the times the professor suggests, then you can say, "Gee, I'm terribly sorry, Professor, I can't come those times. How about this time?" Don't leave your needs. And similarly, like on grades, you guys are both very concerned about grades, which I understand, but also very sheepish about grades. So if you do poorly on a test, and I'm not saying from the professor, go see the professor. Don't be ashamed. The professor has botched exams. The professor has, most professors, some are jerks, but most of them are going to be kind to you, and you'll get guidance on how to approach the topic, how to approach the exams. Plus, the professor will know who you are. And professors are human, and they take sympathy on struggling students. If you've never met the student and they're doing poorly in your course, that's like the worst kiss of death. So any of you that did poorly on the exam, and that's like I said, there are very few of you, you'll get an email from your TF or maybe from me saying, "Come and see me." Don't ignore the email. Just come and see us. You're depressed. You've broken an extremity. Something's happened in your life. You ignored the class initially, or you took it for granted, or you didn't study enough, or you made a stupid mistake. Just see us. It's all rectifiable. People understand what I'm saying? So don't over-exaggerate nor minimize these things. Have a balanced and calibrated point of view. The other thing is that you don't, I'm eager to talk to you guys, so just come to office hours or email me. You don't have to have anything to say. Like last week or 2 weeks ago, people room and the table in my lab chatting about stuff, and I'm happy to do that. We even got into a conversation about relationships, which, and hookup culture. Not that I have anything to say about that. So, all right. Any questions on the material so far? One more thing. The performance in this class and participation in the class, so I'll just say with you. I love teaching this class. I've been doing it for about 9 years. I change it about every year. I try to improve it, bring up the readings. I take notes after every lecture to myself how I can improve my performance the next time. I'm constantly trying to clarify and improve the slides, catch typos and everything else. I try to hire the best TFs that we can hire. I try to put the best procedures into place. I'm very eager to teach you, to have you guys learn things. I pick the readings very carefully so that they present complementary points of view, so that the readings are in tension with each other, so that the readings are interesting and that there are not too many of them, 110 pages a week on average, which is not overwhelming. But I do expect you to do the readings. It's not crazy to do that. Even though my lectures, I think, are pretty clear, and even though I talk about all the readings in every lecture, because I want the readings and the lectures to intersect, unlike professors who have readings and lectures that aren't connected, but that doesn't mean you can't do the readings. So a number of you some of the TFs have told me before I came to class, last week before we were making up the exam, that they were concerned that some students in section just appeared not to have been doing the readings, and maybe thinking that, well, because I covered the material in lecture, they know what's going on. Actually, no, the lectures and the readings are complementary, interlock with each other. You have to do both. And in fact, on the exam, some of you clearly hadn't read this stuff. Like some of you hadn't read Emily Martin's book. I only assigned 60 or 80 pages in that book, and it's a very good reading assignment. Or you hadn't read Lincoln Phelan's very important article. And, if you haven't done the readings, it's going to be a problem. Similarly, showing up in class. You're in college, you have lives, you don't show up at lecture, it's not the end of the world. I'm not telling you to disappear, but, I get it. I understand what it means to have a complicated life and to make choices about whether to go to lecture. And we broadcast the lectures to make your life easy. But if you don't come to lectures and you miss many lectures, it's going to catch up with you. The material is cumulative, ideas refer to each other, and the exams feature slides taken from the lectures. That's what professors do. So you know, do the readings, show up to class, you know, good basic study skills. Ugh, what a bummer notice to say, but I don't mean it that way. I mean it in a good way. I mean, you know, I'm invested in the learning. So I will questions on the material. Raise your hands if you think like left wing. Raise your hands. Raise your hands if you think I'm right wing. Nobody thinks I have right wing positions on anything? Wow. Okay. So look, I see myself as fairly apolitical when it comes to issues of policy. Like what I'm interested in is I'm interested in what works. I'm interested in the best scientific understanding of the problems before us, and I'm interested in a complete, you know, working solution to the problem. If this involves market-oriented, libertarian types of solutions focused on individuals, I'm totally cool with that. If this involves sort of communal, you know, sort of collective government interventions, I'm totally cool with that as well. So I'm just interested in what works. Yeah? No, I think it has to be that way. I mean, yes, disciplines tend to join, you know, tend to recruit, either cultivate or recruit different kinds of political postures. I mean, I have my own political views, which I'm actually not ashamed of and I'm happy to discuss, but that's not what I'm interested in this class. I mean, sometimes I digress and I come on a topic, but I'm just really genuinely interested in is what are the sources of ill health in our society and how can we intervene? I don't see that as a terribly political topic. You know, I don't see it as any more political than discussions of chemistry, almost, not quite. Even chemistry can be politicized. When I was an undergraduate here, years and years ago, I was a biology major, and I had a professor by the name of Arthur Galston. Has any one of you heard of this man? He was already in his 60s when I was a student, so I'm sure I don't know if he's alive or dead. Actually, that makes me want to digress and tell you another story. So when I moved to, and then I'll come back, remind me of the Galston story. When I moved to Massachusetts from University of Chicago, before I went to Harvard, I had been at Chicago for 6 years. Before that, I had done my residency at the University of Pennsylvania. And the man who was the director was, he was a giant of a physician, like a master clinician. He was already a silver-haired guy. He would walk into a patient's room and just look at the patient and know what was the problem and what to do. And we worshiped this man, like all of us 20-year-old, 24-year-old doctors. We looked at him like he was a god. And he would write these little notes in the chart that were one sentence. Patient has amyloidosis. Proceed as follows. You know, and we're like, oh my God, you know, and we would know exactly what to do, or he would know what to do. So we loved this guy, so he had trained me and all these other doctors, and I went to the University of Chicago, and then years later I moved to Massachusetts, and Massachusetts has these crazy licensing requirements when you're supposed to get your license, and they required me, as part of my application for medical license in the state of Massachusetts, to get a recommendation letter from my residency program director. This would be like asking you to get a recommendation letter from your nursery school teacher, right? To find your nursery school teacher and have her send me a letter before I would make an appointment with you or something. I mean, just really, you know, you might not even know who this person was. So this is crazy. How am I going to get this to happen? And I was in a panic, and I had thought that because he was already quite old when I had him as a teacher, that he'd be dead. And so I called the central number for the University of Pennsylvania Hospital, and I said, could I please speak to Donald Martin? And half expected him to say he's not here anymore. They said, oh, yes, right away, sir. And they patched me through, and the phone rings, and there's his voice, which I can't forget, saying, you know, hello, this is Dr. Martin. And I had been so disinhibited from my anxiety about the necessity of getting this letter, I blurted out, I said to him, oh my God, Dr. Martin, I'm so glad you're alive. And then I said, oh, I'm so sorry, sir. You know, like, can I have a recommendation letter? I was like, total idiot. So anyway, so Professor Galston, I don't know if he's still alive. I don't want to make the same mistake. But Professor Galston, when I was an undergraduate here, he taught a course in bioethics in the biology department. And I was very interested in medical ethics at the time. I still am to some extent. And I took his course. There was a seminar class. And he taught this incredible course. And then at some point in the course, we did a case study. And the case study was of a botanist who in the 1940s or 1950s had been investigating auxins. Who knows what auxins are? Raise your hands if you know what an auxin, A-U-X-I-N. These are plant hormones. You do know what they are, plant hormones that are responsible for how trees know where to send out a bud. You know, is it here or there? Has to do with the concentration of auxins in ways I no longer remember. Anyway, this guy had been investigating plant hormones and how these hormones work. Gotten his PhD, working in this obscure lab in Colorado, and one day, 3 guys in military uniforms with hats and medals show up at his office, and they say, you know, Professor so-and-so, we've been very interested in your work. And he was very flattered that anyone would be paying any attention to his work, let alone someone involved in the United States Army. And they asked him all about his work on plant hormones. Does anyone know where this story is going? It's hard to make the link intellectually. So he tells them all about his work. They're very, very interested. And about 10 years later, he discovers that actually his research had been used as a fundamental determinant for the composition of Agent Orange, a chemical used to defoliate forests. Because the Army realized that if we could figure out how these hormones work, we could stop forests from budding, we could denude forests, and then find the Viet Cong who were hiding in these forests and were difficult for us to bomb. So this guy felt horrible about the use of his work and became very interested. Who would have thought that someone investigating plant hormones would create any kind of ethical dilemmas? And he was, in fact, Arthur Galston, my professor of botany, teaching a course in medical ethics. How did I get onto this topic? Politicized, yeah. So chemistry, thank you. So even something seemingly so apolitical as chemistry or plant hormones can actually be politicized. And of course, public health can be politicized. But like what I'm interested in is actually pragmatic solutions to health problems. I want the world to be better. I want it to be healthier. I want it to be more cooperative. I want it to be more innovative. I'm interested in the kind of civilization we build for ourselves, that all of you and I together build for ourselves. And the part that I'm doing research on and I'm most interested in nowadays is, of course, health and cooperation like that. So, anyway, that's my little spiel on that. Any other questions about the material? Okay, so last time we discussed different ways of conceiving of the causes of death with a particular emphasis on health behaviors and on obesity. So we started to make a transition from a kind of one way of thinking of the causes of death, a list of top 10 killers we've been looking at for the last 10 lectures, beginning to shift now to a different way of looking at the top 10 killers. We discussed the patterning of obesity, in particular, one of the leading killers, by race, sex, and income. And we talked about various determinants of obesity, including changing social norms. And finally, policy interventions to address public health problems, like changes in laws and counter-marketing campaigns. And I want to reiterate a point that I made last time about non-discrimination, especially given the images of obese individuals that are a necessary part of understanding this topic. The point of the picture of the woman in the pink bikini is to show you how complicated this topic is. Because normalizing big size is both predictable from a sociological standpoint and understandable in terms of social norm theory, but also problematic from a public health point of view. There's no easy way to discuss that topic, just like there's no easy way oftentimes to talk about race, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't discuss them and actually try to think soberly and cogently and apolitically, to the extent possible, about these sorts of things. Today we're going to be talking about tobacco, to a lesser extent firearms, and the structural determinants of violent death. And I'm not actually going to talk about alcohol, but it's in the readings. Now, tobacco, as we saw the last time, is a leading killer. It's actually on the top of the list, even above diet and activity and obesity. And it's a leading killer, despite the fact that cigarette consumption has been declining in the United States since the 1950s. And the reason is that, despite the decline, we are still nowhere near where we were 100 years ago. So if you look at number of cigarettes consumed per person 100 years ago, it's extremely low. You know, it's rising up to the Great Depression. There's a little dip there, of course. People are poor. They can't buy cigarettes. Incidentally, this is a point we'll come back to, how the price of cigarettes and the relative ability to purchase consumption for cigarettes. It's rising and rising till the end of World War II. Initially, right after World War II, scientists begin to make the connection between smoking and cancer. There's the very famous first Surgeon General's report that was released in the late 1960s And since then, that's the peak of the epidemic. We've begun to have increasing or decreasing consumption of cigarettes. Here is the federal cigarette tax doubles in the 1980s as a kind of public health intervention to try to stimulate the further decline of tobacco. And we'll come to some research that has looked at how taxation affects tobacco later in the class today. It does seem to have some effect. But despite the fact that it's been declining over your lifetimes, we're still nowhere near where we were. I mean, we're sort of back to where we were in the 1940s. We're nowhere near where we were even during some baseline period where tobacco did not have the same kind of penetration. And there are about 45 million Americans who are smokers in the United States today, and the prevalence among adults is about 28% of adults smoke. Probably something like that. A quarter of you guys may smoke. It's a very ill-advised thing to do. Average consumption is 2,200 cigarettes, or about a third of a pack a day in Americans. And looking more closely at 1991, and also looking at patterns by age, we see that the recent decline in cigarette consumption is not uniform across age groups. The youngest group, which is 18 to 24, and it includes you, has been increasing in its cigarettes over the past time period, and almost 30% of them now smoke. I said 25% of Yaleys because it also tracks with social class and education. You guys are less likely to smoke than otherwise identical individuals to you who are less educated and are not. And among the young, those that are minorities and those that are of lower SES are more likely to initiate smoking and less likely to quit. Now, why exactly does tobacco? Nicotine, which is the key addictive component of tobacco, is itself highly toxic and can threaten your life, can cause problems for you. It's the nicotine that causes the addiction to the tobacco. But tobacco has many more things even than that. Tobacco smoke has over 4,000 chemicals and at least 50 known harmful substances. Not just tar, but also heavy metals like cadmium and lead. It has cyanide in it, nitrogen oxides, benzoate-pyrene, carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is, a killer. Vinyl chloride, acetaldehyde, sodium hydroxide, which is like lye, or a very strong base. Raise your hands if you ever did that experiment in high school where you put sodium hydroxide in water. Raise your hands. Yeah? Okay, you get the big flames on the surface of the water. Well, that's in tobacco smoke. And the ways affecting multiple organs and increasing the risk for cancer and many other diseases. And in addition, the heat when you ignite a cigarette exceeds 1,000 degrees, and at that temperature of combustion, as the cigarette burns, it releases thousands of toxic particles which are very quickly absorbed into the body. And the organs involved in the absorption of smoke, such as the lungs and the vascular system, and in the excretion of wastes, such as the bladder and the kidney, get very high doses of these toxic substances. So the impact of tobacco is extremely widespread in your body, causing multiple diseases and insult to many parts of your body. And smoking and nicotine are physical and emotional reactions. Weirdly, both feelings of pleasure and relaxation and alertness at the same time. It takes about between 10 and 20 seconds for the nicotine in a cigarette to reach the brain and stimulate the release of various neurotransmitters. And rapid behavioral reinforcement enhances the addiction. So when you smoke a cigarette, bloodstream to your brain, within seconds, and diverse other sorts of chemicals, and eventually leads to neuroadaptation. Your brain gets used to having the nicotine around, upregulates the receptors, and so you need more and more nicotine to get the same effect. You get used to the exposure to nicotine, so you have to keep consuming it at a biological level given your body's adaptation to it. But in addition, you get behavioral reinforcement. Like I have this problem with cans of Diet Coke. I think that I have to be holding a can of Diet Coke when I'm writing. It's weird. And it has to be cold and it has to be a can. If it's plastic or warm or not Diet Coke, it's a problem for me. And so I've resorted now to like pouring cold water in these cans and drinking them, and that almost is good enough. Because it's not just the caffeine that's helping me perform, it's the whole ritual of holding this thing and getting your cup of coffee and all of that stuff that goes with the rush of the caffeine or the nicotine that makes you, that reinforces the biological addiction. Now, neuroadaptation sets in, and the body and the brain develops more nicotine receptors, and so requires increasing amounts of nicotine to achieve the same effects. And constant amounts of nicotine seem to give less and less of a rush. The brain gets used to nicotine and needs it, in fact, just to function normally. And it's really, really hard to quit, even after getting a very substantial health shock. If you're an older person and you're told you have lung cancer, for example, it's still hard to quit. When we look at people who are, at least 70% of smokers want to give up. They know it's not good for them. Each year, nearly 35 million people make a concerted effort to quit smoking, but less than 7% stay smoke-free for a year, and most start smoking again within days. It's tough to do this. 40% of heart attack smokers relapse while still in the hospital within 2 days of intensive care. You have a big heart attack, you come to the hospital, you're in the ICU, and we find them smoking again outside the hospital or sometimes in the bathroom. 50% of patients with laryngitis. So you have cancer of your voice box. We take out your voice box. You have a little hole there now. You can't speak anymore. And people put a cigarette in the hole so they can smoke through the hole, even though they've had this catastrophic in their body. Patients with a lung removed from lung cancer smoke again. So they have been shown the difficulty of smoking, but the bad news is that they still smoke. Smoking harder to quit than those other addictions that they have. So how addictive is nicotine? This slide shows the results of the study of the subjective and physiologic effects of intravenously administered cocaine and intravenously administered nicotine, which were compared in 10 cigarette-smoking cocaine abusers. So we've got people who are abusing cocaine and cigarettes. We bring them into the lab. We're going to inject them with cocaine and with nicotine. Don't try this at home. And under double-blind conditions, subjects received either placebo, cocaine at 3 different doses, or nicotine at 3 different doses in mixed order. And physiologic and subjective data were collected before and repeatedly after each intravenous drug administration. And what they found was that cocaine and nicotine in the study, the nicotine was stronger than cocaine. It also felt to be a bit more jittery. Nicotine was frequently misidentified as cocaine. These guys who knew about cocaine and nicotine couldn't tell the difference. So powerful is nicotine when administered in this fashion. And the tobacco companies were aware of the addictive properties of nicotine and the efficiency with which cigarettes can deliver them. As a result of lawsuits launched against tobacco companies in the 1990s, an enormous trove of internal industry documents were released. Historian Alan Brandt's wonderful book, The Cigarette Century. Thus, we now have access to numerous internal company documents. And this was a comment from 1970 by William Dunn at Philip Morris. The cigarette should be conceived not as a product, but as a package. The product is nicotine. Think of the cigarette pack as a storage container for a day's supply of nicotine. Think of the cigarette as a dispenser for a dose unit of nicotine. Smoke is beyond question the most optimized vehicle of nicotine, and the cigarette the most optimized dispenser of smoke. These guys are fully aware of what nicotine, the addictive properties of nicotine. This is from another document. Account for the fact that the beginning smoker will not tolerate the unpleasantness, we must invoke a psychosocial motive. Smoking a cigarette for the beginner is a symbolic act. The smoker is telling his world, this is the kind of person I am. Surely there are variants of this theme. I am no longer my mother's child. I am tough. I am not a square. That's an old-fashioned word. Whatever the individual is, the act of smoking remains a symbolic declaration of personal identity. This is another Philip Morris document from 1969. Indeed, tobacco companies have become experts on the psychosocial aspects of growing up, so much because so much of their business is bound up in understanding how to motivate young people to start smoking. So those of you that have ever tried a cigarette, think back on why you did your first cigarette. Believe me, the tobacco companies fully understood how and why you made that first, took that first smoke. And they understand that young smokers addicted to nicotine. Here's another document. When the psychosocial symbolism subsides, the pharmacologic effect takes over to sustain the habit. Because it kills its users, but also because it kills innocent bystanders. And similar phenomena of secondhand effects, of so-called externalities, obtained with other behavioral causes of death, such as accidents, alcohol use, and sexual behaviors. And we'll be talking about some of these later in the course. Secondhand smoke, the fact that when I smoke a cigarette and exhale, and then you inhale the smoke that I've exhaled, it was classified as a carcinogen in 1993. So we declared that secondhand smoke is carcinogenic. It also has over 4,000 chemicals, more than 50 known carcinogens. 60% of non-smokers in the United States have biological evidence of secondhand smoke exposure. And this causes in itself 3,000 lung cancer deaths and 35,000 heart disease deaths per year. 3,000 people die from cancer, lung cancer in this country, not because they smoke their own tobacco, but because they're inhaling the exhaled smoke of other people around them. And new asthma cases in children every year, and between 150 and 300,000 bronchitis pneumonia cases in babies every year. And 2 hours spent in a smoky bar are equivalent to smoking 4 cigarettes. So exposure to other people's tobacco can kill you, and does kill many thousands of Americans every year. Now, this phenomenon of secondhand smoke, or externalities, or knock-on effects that occur outside the individual actor, the individual agent, this phenomenon of secondhand smoke was critical in the movement against tobacco. Smoking imposes externalities that are useful motivators for regulation and public policy. And these are not obviously present in the case of obesity. So unlike last time, it's not obviously obvious to me why your weight gain might harm me, although people are beginning to make that case. But it is pretty clear why your smoking harms me. And so therefore the state and I have an interest in regulating your tobacco, your smoking. But the addictive properties of cigarettes and the issue of harmfulness of secondhand smoke were key facts that have motivated a public health response to smoking, focusing on the structure and not just the agency. So we say this is not just a question of agency and individual choice for 2 reasons. First, the person is not himself. He's addicted to this thing. He or she can't help it. Second, his or her choice doesn't just affect him or her, it affects me as well. So I have an interest and a reason to intervene in what this person is doing in their own lives. Structure matters here, not just agency. Some ways to respond to the menace, this menace at the population level. How can we address the structure of the problem and not just the agency involved, especially if addiction is compromising this agency? And how can we do this, especially given the collective and not just the individual risks that the behavior imposes? So there are at least 4 different kinds of policy responses that we can use to respond to the epidemic of tobacco. The first is taxation. We'll talk about this. The second is counter-marketing. We introduced that last time. We'll talk more about it. The third is laws, sort of passage of legislation, for example, regarding clean indoor air. And the third is the kind of dissemination of smoking cessation programs. Let's talk a little bit first about the cost of buying cigarettes. A large part of the cost when you buy a pack of cigarettes is in fact the taxes. But the rate of cigarette taxes varies tremendously, from about 2.5 cents per pack in the state of Kentucky to over $2 per pack in the state of New Jersey, with a national average in 2004, so 10 years old now, of 66 cents a pack. The average is much higher, and in some municipalities now, it's like $5 a pack just as for the tax, for cigarette tax. Overall, however, cigarette taxes are still historical high. So here's some data nearly up to the year 2000. Here's the relative rate of the tax, the real excise tax, and per capita smoking. And so the real excise tax was much higher in the 60s and 70s in contemporized dollars than it is today. It's been going up since the 1980s. We've been raising taxes, but we're still not quite as far back in real terms as we were in terms of taxation in the 1970s. And here's what's been happening to per capita consumption of cigarettes. People believe that some of this drop here, the blue line, can be explained by the red line. Yeah. In taxes, I don't know why that, probably various states around the country or whatever were decreasing their taxes. I don't know what caused that. It's a good question. I thought you were going to ask me, was there a relationship on the downward slope with the upward? And I think here you can see a kind of upward sloping of the blue line, consumption, coinciding with this, but it's a little less persuasive than this relationship. I'll show you better studies in a moment looking at the tobacco consumption. I actually don't know why. It must have been changes in attitude in the 1970s and 80s towards this, or lapsing of laws and no political will to pass new ones, things like that. Yeah. They could have, well, it's overdetermined. It could be absolutely due to attitudes. So there are multiple things going on at the same time. So smoking right now, partly because it's seen as less socially acceptable, partly because there are fewer places to smoke. You can't smoke indoors, you can't smoke in restaurants, you can't smoke in planes, you just can't smoke in so many locations. And also because taxes are going up, and so it's more expensive to buy these products. So it's multiple things at once. Did I answer your question? Yeah. Other questions? Yeah. Rachel. You mean just nicotine, those electronic cigarettes? Yeah, I'm sure it would be. But cigarettes have tobacco. It's just processed in certain ways where they mince it up and they treat it in various ways. Those little brown strips in a cigarette are little tiny parts of a tobacco leaf. No. It's the actual tobacco is the main source. They prepare the tobacco in different kinds of chemical processes, you're right, which adds stuff to it. But the tobacco is harmful in and of itself, yeah. And the nicotine is, the tobacco plant is what's delivering the nicotine. Yeah. I don't know a ton about how it actually works. It's a nicotine delivery device. I don't know what else is in electric cigarettes other than nicotine. I think nicotine gum is probably a much safer choice if you really need the nicotine high and are a smoker. It's pretty safe to switch to nicotine gum. It's still not ideal. I mean, ideally you would not be on that either. But I don't know about electronic cigarettes, what they deliver other than nicotine. If you find out, email me. I'd like to know. Maybe I'll add that for next year. I should actually add that. Yeah. Yes. I don't know enough about electronic cigarettes, and I should know to answer these questions. For example, I honestly don't know whether you exhale smoke. If you inhale, it's water vapor, yeah. So if you're exhaling water vapor, I don't think it's going to cause secondhand effects, but that would depend on what else is in it other than nicotine. If it's just the nicotine suspension in water, then I don't think it's going to cause much secondhand smoke problems. But if it has a lot of other chemicals, then for sure, whatever you take in, you're also exhaling part of it. So I don't know the composition of electronic cigarettes. Otherwise, I'd be better positioned to answer these questions. But if any of you have asked these questions, send me some links, then I will learn, and next year I'll include that. Other questions? I don't think if the tenor of these questions is to say, well, can I just smoke electronic cigarettes? You know, Professor, can I have permission to smoke electronic cigarettes? The answer is, niet. You can't. Not a good idea. And nor is nicotine gum necessarily, but I can tell you that nicotine gum is definitely better than cigarettes for your health. And it turns out that numerous economic studies have documented that the purchasers of cigarettes are sensitive to the price. Every 10% increase in the price of cigarettes results in a 4% decrease in use of cigarettes over a broad branch of studies. And this gives us a very effective public health lever with which to affect behavior change. From a very specific study looking at the effective taxes on the smoking cessation habits of pregnant women. Now, pregnant women are very powerfully motivated to quit smoking. So if you want to find a sample of people who are trying to quit, it would be pregnant women, right? They know that if they smoke, they're also going to harm their baby. And smoking has significant detrimental effects on children's health. For example, prenatal smoking accounts for 20% of low birth weight babies and is the most important modifiable risk factor for poor pregnancy outcomes. And postnatal smoking doubles the risk of sudden infant death syndrome, which we discussed earlier in the Back to Sleep campaign, and is a major risk factor for respiratory illness, middle ear problems, and asthma in children. So smoking moms really harms their babies and their kids. Smoking dads too, incidentally, but I'm just talking about mom right now in this study. figure compares the quit rate for women in New York and Washington State, where cigarette taxes were raised early in the sample period, to the quit rate for women in 6 states that did not raise taxes. And as the figure illustrates, the quit rate in the 2 affected states rose by approximately 15 percentage points between 1994 and 1996, while the quit rate for the quit rate amongst pregnant women for the unaffected states remained relatively constant. So if you look here, here's the percent. In those states after the passage of taxes, which make it more expensive for women to buy tobacco. And in fact, a 10% increase in cigarette taxes increases the probability of a woman quitting smoking during pregnancy by 10%. Now, why is this rate higher than the previous figure I just told you, where 10% increase in taxes leads to a 4% higher quit rate? Yeah? Yeah, exactly. So these are pregnant women. They're even more powerfully motivated to quit. And that's why this rate is even higher. Plus, two potential people benefit here, both the mom and the baby. So we are getting a real bang for our buck when we get pregnant women to quit smoking. And the authors estimate that a 30-cent increase in taxes would have approximately the same effect on quit rates as enrolling women in prenatal smoking cessation programs. So we can either go out painstakingly and one woman at a time bring her into an intense smoking cessation program, or just add 30% and 30 cents per pack in taxes to the tobacco across the whole country and get the same bang with a much simpler, cleaner policy intervention. Taxes work really well because people are motivated by money. Unfortunately, they're also motivated by sex. And the tobacco industry has a long history of using it to sell cigarettes. So here's some tobacco advertising. There's another internal memo at the bottom. It says, Camel smokers in the trend-setting urban exotic. And here's some ads to women from an earlier period in time. Smoking is seen as a way to get slow down, pleasure up. This woman looks ready to have sex to me. Here, French fries. If I this fast food offer that's being given to her. And here this woman says, until I find a real man, I'll take a real smoke. So now she can just dismiss the man altogether. She can just have the cigarette instead. How convenient. And so she can just replace guys with her tobacco addiction. And here are some ads also presumably targeted at young women. Even the girl with the dragon tattoo. These ads are well before this was done. So, here are from an earlier period in time, these, trend-setting young smoking cigarettes and sending a certain signal with these ads. These ads seem more targeted at men, though it's really unclear whether guys are such dopes that they would fall for this stuff. Here on the back here, playing to some insecurities, Pall Mall Gold 100 filters further from the power of smoke. And they're comparing the length of this cigarette, which I think is sending a certain message. Here, blow in her face and she'll follow you anywhere. I find that very hard to believe. Apparently, this was felt to be an effective advertising campaign. Now, and here's a ad. Raise your hands. You know who this character is. Who is this character? Yeah? Joe Camel, or Joe Cool. He's a cool guy. Interesting is a study was done, published in JAMA a few years ago, looking at a 5-year-old's ability to recognize Mickey Mouse and Joe Camel, and they were more able to recognize Joe Camel than Mickey Mouse because so prevalent was it and so widely distributed. So he's cool, Joe Camel. Lots of people have made a lot of the kind of penis and testicles appearance, and if you hadn't seen it before, now you'll never be able to unlearn it, of Joe Camel, which is, obviously very phallic imagery in this situation. Now, counter-marketing seeks to use the same kind of tools that are used by marketers trying to sell products, like sex and humor, but seeks to use them to make smoking less desirable rather than more desirable. And we saw a bit of this the last time with respect to obesity. And here are just a few examples with respect to smoking, starting again with the famous character Joe Camel. Here is Joe Chemo. So these taken out around the country. Now Joe Camel, you know, he's quite deflated. No, I don't feel sorry for Joe Camel, I have to say. You know, he has no business to be smoking. And smoking may reduce blood flow and cause impotence. Here is a campaign. Smoking may reduce blood flow and cause impotence with a kind of no longer a nice long straight cigarette by a droopy cigarette. You know, and it says brand there, but we all know what brand this evokes, this packaging. I think this was actually from a campaign in Egypt, in Cairo. Or you can take advantage of the health externalities of secondhand smoke. Here's an image that takes advantage. Remember when we saw that one time of people going swimming and everything's so great, and then the bombs start blowing up? You know, that contrast between violence and innocence, which is shocking. This, again, tries to play on that. Women married to a smoker have a 91% greater risk of heart disease. So she's put into pride. That powerful. Or uses cats to make cats smoking, trying to play on people's love of videos that involve cats. Like some shocking fraction of our videos have cats in them, but also, you know, kind of contrast this, again, this kind of shock value of this contrast. Or cleverly exploits street art or disgust. So this is a very clever street artist who has painted a sewer in the mouth of a smoker and painted this little thing like a cigarette. You know, how gross. Your mouth is like a sewer when you smoke. And it, you know, very hip and sort of youthful. And here's one of my favorites. Now remember earlier I told you about hydrogen peroxide, sodium hydroxide, thank you, not hydrogen peroxide, not H2O2, but NaOH. So sodium hydroxide in tobacco. So this is an ad from a very effective counter-marketing group called Truthy, thetruth.com, and you can see others there, some more shocking ones that I didn't want to show in class if you're interested. So here we go. Just pay attention. Oh my God, hold on, I didn't put in the, I have to plug in the sound. You'll have to wait. So I don't know how loud I can get, but I'm going to have to make do with this. All right, I hope you can hear it. Just be quiet there for a second. Here we go. So evoking, you know, you want to see it again or no? Yeah? So these big hairy guys. This is great street performance art. Those women look grossed out. That can't be good for you. So there are many other effective things like that. I mean, that again is not as shocking as the explosions that we saw the last time, but I think subtle and effective. So moving beyond and counter-marketing at some ways that laws prohibiting indoor smoking might work. These laws were driven by the phenomenon of secondhand smoke exposure and the illnesses arising from it. So over the last 20 years or so, more and more states have passed comprehensive clean indoor air laws prohibiting smoking in virtually all public and private workplaces throughout the state, including restaurants, bars, and hotels. And clean indoor air laws typically cover all public places with a special emphasis on healthcare institutions, schools, daycare centers, and so forth. And all schools and children's facilities that receive federal aid have been smoke-free since 1995. And these laws have been shown to be highly effective. So it reduced smoking prevalence between 5 and 10%. 26.4% of smokers who worked in communities with strong ordinances quit smoking within a 6-month period, compared to 19.1% of those in areas with no ordinance. And a smoking ban in Helena, Montana produced a 40% decrease in hospital admissions for acute myocardial infarction, for heart attacks, over a 6-month period. So laws work in changing people's behavior. And finally, let's turn to some, with respect to tobacco, and then we'll move on to guns. Let's turn to some techniques that can be used on individual patients. And as we saw earlier, there are about 46 million smokers in the United States, and 70% of them would like to quit, but each year less than 5% are able to quit without assistance. And the odds of successful quitting can be increased, doubled, or even tripled when you use some of the following techniques: counseling programs, nicotine replacement therapy, drugs, different kinds of drugs like bupropion and others, and quit lines, or telephonic access to people who can get you through the jittery moment when you want another cigarette. Counseling can be very effective, especially if financial incentives are applied. For example, one study showed that providing financial incentives of up to $750 increased quit rates at 1 year from 5% to nearly 15% by offering people $750 to quit smoking. And nicotine replacement is available in an amazing variety of forms: gum, lozenges, patches, inhalers, nasal sprays, and so forth. And quit lines are very cheap and have a very high marginal return. And there are increasingly high-tech internet equivalents like QuitNet, for example. Online support is also increasingly available. Unfortunately, insurance coverage for such interventions is patchy at best. But at the federal level, it's not bad. If you have Medicaid or Medicare, these things are actually adequate. And here's a recent online tool that was invented by Professor Dean Carlin here at Yale. Have you guys had a lecture with Professor Carlin? Raise your hands. He's a very cool guy in the economics department. So he, I don't have time today, but he had a very interesting story on how he found a company called take a contract out on yourself. When you and I agree that we will engage in some practice and we put an amount of money at stake, it's like a bet to each of us try to lose weight or quit smoking. And so if you go to the website stick.com, you can pick something to commit, and they have an interesting way of financially to do that. Now I'd like to make a few remarks about, is any questions about smoking? So let's move on to guns, firearms, and public health. Firearm homicides rates for young men in the United States are between 10 and 300 times, the rates we have compared to other industrialized nations, whereas non-firearm rates of homicide are only between 1.5 and 10 times greater. So we kill more people, more of each other than other countries do at a slightly higher rate, but when it comes to, without guns, but when it comes to using guns, we can be as much as 300 times more lethal to our compatriots. So the question is, why is this difference important? Why is the difference between non-firearm and firearm fatalities important? And the difference is that guns have not replaced other violence. It's not the case that I was going to kill you anyway with a knife, and instead I just chose a gun. Actually, the availability of guns must be increasing my propensity to kill you, is the argument that's made by looking across countries in this fashion. It's not as if the United States, Americans, are intrinsically much more violent. And in fact, in 1986, there were 1,043 gun homicides in males aged between 15 and 19, whereas there were 6 in all of Canada and 2 in all of Japan. So we had over 1,000 young people die from gun homicides in this country, and just 2 in all of Japan. And here are some rates in homicides in young people in different countries. Mechanisms of homicides among 50. Now, these percentages here might not be so different. So if you compare Scotland to the United States, we kill about as many people by cutting and piercing as the Scots do, but we kill 100 times more, or some huge number, by guns. So the firearm rates are what's so different in one place to another. Now, the Kellerman study from your readings for today gives you a feel for the frequency and age and race distribution of not just deaths, but more broadly, injuries due to firearms in the United States. And this study defined an injury as resulting from the discharge of a firearm prompting emergency medical attention. And overall, in the 3 cities studied, which were Seattle, Memphis, and Galveston, Texas, there were between 110 and 160 injuries due to firearms per 100,000 people per year, or somewhat over 1 per 1,000 people per year. And 88% of these injuries occurred, 7% during suicide attempts, and 4% were unintentional injuries. And overall, 19% of the injuries were fatal. But look at the variation by age and race. So this slide shows firearm-related injuries. Of people dying from guns, a very high percentage of individuals. Yeah. Yes, per 100,000 black males. Yeah. So this is amongst this subgroup, amongst black, ridiculously high, an epidemic of gun violence killing this segment of our population. And so men are obviously more violent than women. And they're also the victims. In fairness, men are more violent than women, but they typically kill other men. Men are also the victims of more violence, and there's a peak in youth. And the burden in minority populations is enormous. And numerous epidemiological studies and designs confirm that gun availability increases successful suicides and homicides, and hence death. Now, this is a big literature, and there are lots of studies. And some of them show no increased homicide due to guns, but most show increased homicide. And some show no effect of homicide, of guns on suicide, but the great majority, especially if the better conducted studies, show an effect. So you can find studies that contravene what I'm about to tell you, but what I'm about to describe represents a kind of, I would think, fair summary of an enormous literature. So this study, and I don't remember if this study looks at rates of household firearms. Okay? So if you kill yourself by drowning yourself or hanging yourself or taking pills, you're not as likely to do it regardless of what you're in. But you're much more likely to kill yourself with a gun in a state where there are lots of guns, as shown by these three compared to the below it. So this, again, is suggestive evidence. This is at the state level. There are all kinds of methodologic issues here, but very suggestive evidence that what the availability of guns does is it makes it easier for people who wish to kill themselves. Just like the example we opened the class with. You know, if you stop the person from killing themselves, if we change the structure of our society such that we don't have guns as available, we will interfere with a person's agency. here attempting to kill themselves. Now, killing themselves is something that you do to yourself, but as we know, the real issue with guns is not the real issue. An additional important issue with guns is the externalities that guns impose. If the only thing bad that happened in our society is that people would buy guns and kill themselves, we might not be so concerned. I would still be concerned. But the problem is people buy guns and kill other people, sometimes accidentally, sometimes deliberately. Possible to treat guns as a threat to public safety and to regulate them. And there should be, in fact, or there would appear to be, widespread support. So I think this is for the percent who favored or strongly favored all respondents, and even amongst people who own guns. So people who own guns know how dangerous guns are. They're not stupid. They have often very rational ideas about what should be done with guns. It's actually a small minority of gun owners that's driving the gun policy in the country. So 64% of gun owners think that government regulation of gun design is a good idea, the same as all respondents. 93% thinks that there should be the same standards for domestic guns as for imported guns. Childproofing of all new handguns. Why do guns need to be used by children? Children to use guns. Big majority of both owned and non-gun for new handguns also ideas. In fact, the success in the United States in reducing motor vehicle injuries, we now have one of the lowest rates of death per vehicle mile in the world, provides insight into methods that we could presumably use to decrease or reduce firearm injuries. Look, in the 1950s, there were a lot of efforts to reduce motor vehicle injuries focused on the driver, and the data were interpreted to suggest that almost all automobile crashes were caused by errors on the driver's part. So the mentality in the 1950s was very similar now to the iatrogenesis example we discussed a couple of lectures ago, focusing on the agency of the driver. And the greatest attention was thus paid to the education and enforcement, training motorists to drive better and punishing them for committing safety violations. And this is similar to the medical harm and patient safety movements we discussed. But eventually, injury control experts recognized that to increase the safety of driving, it would be more cost-effective to try to change the vehicle and change the highway rather than change human behavior. And there was a shift from a focus on agency to a focus on structure. And thus, numerous alterations were made, both in cars and in roads, to make collisions less likely, for example, better brakes in cars, or dividing our highways. Prior to the 1950s, we didn't have divided highways as much. When you divide the highways, structural change, you can't have as many head-on collisions. Or to make injuries more avoidable, if there was a collision, for example, the design of collapsible steering columns, non-rupturable gas tanks, breakaway road signs, so if you hit the road, it breaks away rather than forming a rigid surface, more advanced emergency medical systems, seatbelt design, and so on. Nobody believes that today's drivers are more careful than those of the 1950s. Yet the number of motor vehicle fatalities per mile has been reduced by more than 75% in the last 50 years. And firearms, like motor vehicles, lawnmowers, and chainsaws, are consumer products that can cause injury. The safety of virtually every consumer product is regulated by federal or state government, and the conspicuous exception is the gun. And unfortunately, as Hemingway points out in your readings, because firearms have been deliberately exempted from the oversight of the Consumer Product Safety Commission, we are, in the United States, in the indefensible position of having stronger consumer protection standards for toy guns and even for teddy bears than for real guns. It is harder to manufacture and sell a toy gun in this country than to manufacture and sell a real gun when it comes to regulations in this regard. Here's another, so we need to begin to think about the fact that guns are one of the leading killers in our society, a top 10 killer, in this kind of way, in this kind of public health way, looking at the structure around individuals, trying to think of what interventions we might make to reduce this epidemic. Here's another very well-known case of how structure can affect agency, similar to the gun control or the example. So for a variety of reasons related to how natural gas was produced in this time period, shifting from the use of coal to produce natural gas to North Sea sources, The carbon monoxide content of gas declined in England. This is a very famous. Monoxide. It's a kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Like an unintended or undesired, not byproduct, but component of natural gas. What you really want to burn is the methane, the CH4, but unavoidably there was some carbon monoxide in the methane that you were trying to burn. And this rate came down because of a shift in the use from coal to North Sea natural gas in this time period. And here's what happened as a result of that. This slide shows blue lines show so the black carbon monoxide. Not as easily. You can still die, of course, if you inhale methane gas, but it's not quite as easy. So there were 2,500 suicides in 1960 from carbon monoxide, and in 1977, 17 years later, there were 8. So we went from 2,500 suicides by carbon monoxide in 1960 to 8 suicides in England, to 17 years later to 8. And the overall suicide rates declined from 14 to 10 for males and from 9 to 6.5 for females. Motor vehicle exhaust studies also suggest that catalytic converters have decreased the rate of carbon monoxide suicides in the United States. So we add catalytic converters to optimize combustion in the engines in the United States and have the secondary effect of fewer people being able to kill themselves by inhaling the exhaust from a car. All right? A structural change, here non-deliberately done, that results in preventing people like suicide nets from being able to kill themselves. And interestingly, there's interesting variation in suicide rates by age, gender, and race. It's not the pattern that's similar to gun fatalities, to murders. These are data from 1997, and white men exceed others at all ages in killing. So this is the rate for white men, and actually interestingly, flat. So there's an age patterning and race patterning in suicide as well. So let me close with a key, very important, big idea from today's lecture that will also inform lectures in the coming weeks. Because the question becomes, how can we affect public health change? What is a useful way to modify structure so that we can change individual behaviors? This is a cartoon for how water was drawn for use in many households in London in the mid-19th century. Women would put on these bonnets and they would carry buckets to a local pump, and they would pump water and fill buckets and take them back to their houses. And this is an extremely famous piece of data analysis performed by John Snow in the mid-19th century. There was an outbreak of cholera that occurred in the Soho district of London, a very swanky district nowadays, in and around Broad Street, an area called Broad Street, in 1854. And some elements of the story are disputed, but I'm going to tell you the conventional version. John Snow reasoned that if cholera was spread by a mist or a miasma, if it spread through the air, as the prevailing theories then suggested, then the cases should be uniformly distributed across the streets, along the streets. And to see if this was the case, he plotted each cholera case on a map. So this is a map of the Soho area. And he put a little lines. Cases. And he saw that these cases were not uniformly distributed around the Soho district, but instead were distributed in a tight cluster around a water pump So he went to the pump and he took a water sample, and under the microscope, he found that the water contained a bacteria which he had not seen before. And he reasoned that these bacteria might be responsible for cholera. And he went back to the pump, and extremely famously, he took the handle off the Broad Street pump. This expression has become famous, taking the handle off the Broad Street pump. And the Broad Street cholera outbreak stopped overnight. He made this structural change. He took the handle off the pump, and all the individuals in the area no longer suffered from cholera. And in fact, this is now where the Broad Street pump, this is the corner where the Broad Street pump used to be, and here's a little plaque in London that describes this famous event. And it would be great, in fact, if we could have a handle on the Broad Street pump for many of the collective threats to public health we've been reviewing today. And in many cases, we do have such a handle. We can address the structure and not just the agency. When it comes to accidents, we can think about roadway design. When it comes to smoking, we can think about how cigarettes are marketed. When it comes to firearm deaths, we can think about gun availability. And when it comes to obesity, we can think about school lunches, soft drink machines in elementary schools, the design of our cities, and much else besides, not the least of which is our own social norms. Okay, are there any questions? Yes, by lobbying Congress. I think the political environment is extremely complex and difficult. It's in many ways reflecting certain other, I would say, it's too strong a word to say undemocratic, because we clearly have fair elections and a democratic system in our society. And so to the extent that we have the laws that we do, they reflect our elections, and so those are the laws that we get. But it's also the case that you can have minority co-option in our system. So there are special interests that can result in laws that go against the will of the majority. And so the great majority of Americans and the great majority of gun owners, as I showed you, support a lot of common sense interventions. Like if I had my druthers, we'd be in a society like Japan where there wasn't private gun ownership. But that's just me. I would happily settle for other harm reduction approaches that don't require, let people own guns, okay, but for God's sakes, let's make it hard for kids to use them. Let's regulate bullets. Let's hold people. I don't understand why when a child finds a gun that a parent left us in their house and takes it and kills another child in a school, why the parents aren't held responsible for that. I mean, why you can't have strict liability for your guns, right? You should go to prison if someone uses your gun, your child uses your gun to kill someone else. You should go to prison. So we really need to increase the standards for gun safety, keeping them locked, unloaded, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what I don't, so the question is complex. I think that there has been a kind of capture of the Congress with respect to guns, because I think the majority of people actually would favor a whole lot of very commonsensical things. So I don't think it's a system that we have. It's pretty fair, so it's hard to complain. I think people have to vote on this issue. Yeah. Yes. What's going on? I don't know the exact details of Japan. I know that in China, smoking prevalence is skyrocketing, and the women are lagging the men. So the men have just skyrocketed, and it's, we haven't reached the peak yet, either in men or in women. And rates of tobacco-related injury and deaths are rising dramatically, and this plus the smog in China is going to serve as a restraint on the increase in life expectancy in China. I know that the Japanese smoke a lot. I also know that they live a long time. I don't know how to square that circle except to say that the Japanese would probably live even longer if they weren't smokers. So, yeah. Other ideas? I'll tell you a funny story if no one has a question, and then I'll let you go related to that question. Any other questions? So I was in Greece a few years ago. Greeks have a very interesting kind of Mediterranean mentality, kind of quirky, us versus them kind of way of seeing the world. And there are a couple of problems in Greece right now. Tax avoidance is one of them. Economic catastrophe is related to that is another. And the Greeks have the youngest retirement age in Europe. So Greeks retire at a very young age. But they also have one of the longest life expectancies in the world. The Greeks live a very long time. And so I was giving these lectures in Greece, a set of lectures in Greece 2 or 3 years ago. Look, we cannot have it both ways, I said, speaking in Greek on behalf of Greeks, although I'm an American. I said, we cannot have one of the earliest retirement ages in Europe, but also live longer than anyone else on the planet. Either we need to reduce our life expectancy and live as long as they do in Côte d'Ivoire, or we need to work longer and stop retiring at 58 and start retiring at 65. It's economically unsustainable. And I gave this lecture at a number of venues, and finally on the third person in the back raises their hand and they said, but professor, what you don't understand is the reason we live so long is because we retire early, which is the typical conveniently self-exculpatory posture of Greek culture. See you next time.